New Orleans, 1933. The jazz never stopped, not even after the screams. In the heart of the French Quarter, where magnolia trees veiled whispered sins, a wedding was set to unite two dynasties, the Marcellos, Sicilian-born kings of the docks, and the Delacroix, Creole aristocrats who ran the city's darker affairs from behind velvet. Isabella Marcello, 24, stood at the altar wrapped in imported lace and family expectations. Her groom never arrived. Instead, 3 gunshots echoed through St. Augustine's church. Blood stained the aisle. And yet, her dress remained untouched. The families blamed a rival gang. The newspapers buried the story within days. And Isabella? She vanished behind estate walls, never seen again. 10 years later, in the oppressive heat of a New Orleans summer, Daniel Blake, a retired Pinkerton agent turned funeral director, receives a letter with no return address. The bride is ready to talk. As Daniel steps back into a world of secrets he thought he'd buried, he uncovers a story of betrayal, power, and a silence paid for in blood. Because in New Orleans, some women weren't meant to marry. They were meant to survive and to remember. She waited 10 years in silence. Now, the bride is ready to speak. If you're drawn to Mafia secrets, forgotten weddings, and the men who return to uncover the truth, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and listen closely. Because in New Orleans, some vows echo long after the altar goes cold. Chapter 1. The Bride in St. Augustine's. New Orleans, 1933. The late September air hung thick as molasses over the French Quarter. Heat trapped between the narrow streets refused to yield even as evening approached. Inside St. Augustine's church, perspiration gathered at Isabella Marcello's temples, despite the gentle motion of paper fans fluttering in synchronized waves across the pews. The ornate stained-glass windows, which had witnessed a century of prayers, cast kaleidoscope patterns across her ivory gown, an extravagant creation of Venetian lace and handcrafted pearls that had crossed an ocean to reach her. "You are a vision, mia figlia." Angelo Marcello's weathered hand covered her daughter's trembling fingers. His Sicilian accent, though softened by 20 years in Louisiana, remained as much a part of him as the scars on his knuckles. The Marcellos and Delacroix shake hands today. Business and blood, Isabella. This is greater than any one of us. The church smelled of beeswax candles, white lilies, and the lingering incense from morning mass. Outside, the muted sounds of a brass band drifted from somewhere in the quarter, life continuing its rhythmic pulse, while inside St. Augustine's, time seemed suspended in amber. In the front pew, Elise Delacroix adjusted her hat of midnight blue feathers, her Creole features arranged in practiced serenity. Her husband Joseph sat beside her, his silver-streaked hair slicked back, his posture rigid as the oak pews. The Delacroix family, old New Orleans money that had weathered the Civil War, Reconstruction, and now the Depression with a particular kind of aristocratic resilience. Their son, Richard, would soon walk through those doors and seal a union that had been negotiated over cognac and cigars in back rooms of establishments that appeared on no tourist maps. "They say the Delacroix boy has a temper," whispered Maria, and wandering hands for the girls at the midnight iris. "Maria, per favor, not today." Isabella's voice was barely audible. The organist began a prelude, fingers dancing across yellowed ivory keys. The music swelled, filling the vaulted ceiling with notes that seemed to tremble with their own foreboding. 200 guests shifted in anticipation. Father Benoit approached Isabella with a gentle smile beneath gray brows. "It is time, my child." She nodded, grateful for the veil that concealed the conflict in her eyes. This was her duty. Her father had built an empire from nothing when he arrived from Sicily, controlling half the dock workers, a dozen speakeasies that had transitioned seamlessly into legitimate establishments after Prohibition's end, and protection rackets that kept the quarter's businesses safe. The Delacroix family controlled the rest: politicians, judges, and the high society that the Marcellos, despite their wealth, had never been allowed to enter. Until today. Until Isabella. The doors at the back of the church remained closed beyond their scheduled opening. A murmur rippled through the guests. Father Benoit checked his pocket watch. "Perhaps a small delay," he offered, signaling the organist to continue. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Angelo Marcello's face darkened as he exchanged glances with his consigliere, Salvatore, who slipped discreetly out a side door. Joseph Delacroix's posture grew increasingly rigid, his wife's fan moving with sharper, faster strokes. Then came the sounds. 3 distinct cracks that echoed through the vaulted sanctuary. In another city, another time, they might have been mistaken for car backfires. But in New Orleans, in 1933, in a church filled with people who understood the language of violence, the silence that followed was immediate and complete. Isabella knew. Before the screams began, before the doors burst open, before the chaos erupted, she knew. Her hands clutched her bouquet of white gardenias and jasmine so tightly that the stems cut into her palms. "Stay here," her father commanded, pulling a small revolver from inside his jacket before rushing toward the commotion. The next moments blurred. Women's screams, men shouting, the thud of dress shoes against wooden floors. Isabella stood motionless at the altar, a statue in white, as guests fled past her. Maria tugged at her arm. "Izzy, we must go!" But Isabella remained frozen, watching as Father Benoit was pushed aside by men entering from the vestibule. The whispers reached her in fragments. The groom, on the steps, shot 3 times. Through the open door she could see the red that stained the church steps, red that matched the roses in the arrangements flanking the altar, red that would never reach her pristine white dress. A peculiar calm settled over Isabella as chaos swirled around her. She had spent her life preparing to be a Delacroix bride. Now she would become something else entirely, a symbol, a reminder of the blood price of ambition. It would be hours before the police arrived, asking questions to which everyone already knew the answers but would never speak. It would be days before the newspapers ran small columns about a tragic incident at St. Augustine's, the details suspiciously sparse. And it would be weeks before Isabella Marcello emerged from her locked bedroom in the Marcello mansion on Esplanade Avenue. But in that moment, as she stood untouched in her wedding dress, while blood seeped between the church's stone steps outside, Isabella Marcello made a silent vow. This day would not define her end, but her beginning. 10 years would pass before anyone understood the full meaning of that promise. If this story has touched something in you, if you felt transported to the sultry streets of 1933 New Orleans, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Every story is a doorway to another time, another life, and I'd be honored to have you walk through these doorways with me. Join us, and we can share the whispers of history together. Chapter 2. The Funeral Director. New Orleans, 1943. The oppressive July heat seemed to bend the very light that filtered through the cypress trees. Daniel Blake loosened his tie as he stepped out of Blake & Sons funeral home onto Dauphine Street. At 53, his once auburn hair had faded to a distinguished silver that matched the humid sky threatening rain. His tall frame remained straight, a remnant of his Pinkerton days, but the lines around his eyes had deepened with each body he prepared, each family he consoled. The funeral home had been his sanctuary for 7 years now. After 20 years with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the quiet dignity of preparing the dead had become a peculiar comfort. The dead kept their secrets. They didn't lie, didn't scheme, didn't pull him into webs he couldn't escape. "Mr. Blake, there's post for you." Elijah, his assistant, handed him a cream-colored envelope. No return address, just his name in elegant, slanted handwriting. "Thank you, Elijah. Any calls while I was at the Thibodeau service?" "Just Mrs. Winters asking if we can delay her husband's viewing until her sister arrives from Atlanta. I told her it wouldn't be a problem." Daniel nodded, slipping the envelope into his jacket pocket. "Good. We're finished for today. Go home to that wife of yours." The young man smiled gratefully. "The baby's keeping her up all night. She'll appreciate having me back early." After Elijah left, Daniel retreated to his office at the rear of the building. The space was modest but meticulously organized. Leather-bound appointment books, precisely arranged embalming certificates on the wall, a Remington typewriter positioned at the perfect angle on his mahogany desk. The only personal touches were a photograph of his late wife, Caroline, her eyes bright with joy that the camera had captured 5 years before tuberculosis claimed her, and a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that had accompanied him through the trenches of France in the Great War. He settled into his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. The envelope felt unexpectedly heavy in his hands. Something about it, the quality of the paper perhaps, or the deliberate anonymity of its presentation, stirred the investigative instincts he'd worked so hard to suppress. The seal broke with a satisfying tear. Inside, a single sheet of the same cream-colored paper contained just one line. "The bride is ready to talk." Daniel read it twice, then a third time, as though the sparse words might yield more meaning upon repetition. There was no signature, no explanation, but an address was written at the bottom. Not in the quarter or the garden district, but out by the lake. His throat drew dry. 10 years had passed, but he knew immediately. There was only one bride in New Orleans, whose silence had been so complete, so impenetrable, that it had become almost mythological. Isabella Marcello. In 1933, Daniel was still with the Pinkertons, assigned to investigate insurance fraud cases rather than the bloodier affairs that had occupied his early career. But everyone in New Orleans had heard about the wedding at St. Augustine's. The groom shot dead on the church steps. The bride who disappeared behind the walls of her family estate. The investigation that went nowhere because witnesses suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen, and evidence had a way of vanishing in a city where police captains dined with criminals. The clock on his wall ticked loudly in the silence of his office. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising an evening downpour. Daniel opened his desk drawer and removed a small leather notebook, turning to the entries from a decade ago. His handwriting, precise and slanted, detailed the little information that had been made public about the Marcello-Delacroix wedding.
Richard Delacroix, 29, shot 3 times on the steps of St. Augustine's. 2:17 p.m., September 16, 1933. No witnesses came forward. NOPD investigation closed after 2 weeks. Insufficient evidence. Rumored, conflict with Moretti family from Chicago. He had added his own observations. Angelo Marcello paid for Delacroix's funeral. Unusual gesture. Joseph Delacroix seen meeting with Judge Hollister 3 days after the shooting. Case reassigned from Detective Landry to Detective Perot the following day. Isabella Marcello, no public appearances since incident. Daniel closed the notebook, tapping it against his palm. He'd left the Pinkertons shortly after these notes were taken, when his wife's illness had demanded his full attention. After her death, he'd apprenticed himself to old Mr. Thorne at the funeral home, finding solace in the rituals of death rather than its investigations. "Why now?" he murmured to the empty room. "Why me?" The answer came as he stared at Caroline's photograph. He had prepared Richard Delacroix's body after the shooting. It had been his last case, making a murdered man presentable enough for his open casket funeral. He remembered the wounds, precise, professional, not the work of an angry rival or a jealous lover, but an execution. Daniel had kept that observation to himself. By then, he'd learned which truths were safe to speak in New Orleans and which were best left buried. He folded the note and placed it carefully in his inside pocket. The address was in Lakeview, an area of new developments where old money was beginning to migrate away from the increasingly commercial Garden District. It would take him nearly an hour to get there, longer if the threatening storm broke. As he locked his office, the first fat raindrops began to patter against the windows. He paused at Caroline's portrait. "I should leave this alone," he told her silent smile. "The dead deserve their peace, and the living deserve their secrets." But even as he spoke, Daniel knew he would go. Some mysteries demand resolution, not just for justice, but for the living who remained trapped in their shadows. And perhaps, after years of tending to the dead, he needed to remind himself why the living mattered at all. The drive through New Orleans was like traveling through distinct worlds, from the ornate iron balconies of the French Quarter to the stately mansions of the Garden District, then north through neighborhoods where the Depression had left still visible scars despite the economic revival of war production. The rain fell in sheets, blurring these transitions into a watercolor impression of a city defined by its beautiful decay. The address led him to a modern home set back from the road, its white exterior gleaming wetly in the downpour. No Spanish moss or wrought iron here, just clean lines and large windows that spoke of new money, or, perhaps, old money seeking a fresh start. Daniel parked his black Packard and sat watching the house for several minutes. 10 years of preparing bodies for burial had taught him the value of patience, of observation, before action. No lights shone from within, but a thin curl of smoke rose from one chimney despite the summer heat. Someone was waiting. He stepped out into the rain, felt it immediately soak through his suit jacket, and walked deliberately toward the front door. Before he could knock, it opened. The woman standing there was both familiar and a stranger.
Her dark hair was swept back from a face that had lost its youthful softness but gained a sharp sculptural beauty. Those eyes, amber with flecks of gold, regarded him with an unnerving steadiness. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice lower than he'd expected, textured by years of silence or perhaps cigarettes. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Marcello," he replied, removing his soaked hat. "You said you were ready to talk." Isabella Marcello stepped aside to let him enter, her ivory silk dress rustling softly, a deliberate echo of a wedding gown, he realized, though simplified for a different life, a different woman. "After 10 years," she said, as she closed the door against the storm, "I'm ready to tell you why my groom had to die, and why I had to disappear." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating a room that contained nothing but 2 chairs facing each other, a small table with a crystal decanter, and a manila envelope that waited like a silent accusation between them. Chapter 3. Secrets in Amber. The rain drummed against the windows in rhythmic waves, creating an intimate cocoon around Daniel and Isabella. The house, minimalist and modern, felt like a blank canvas, deliberately stripped of history or personality. No photographs adorned the walls, no heirlooms collected dust on shelves. It was a place of transition, not of living. "Bourbon?" asked Isabella, her hand already reaching for the crystal decanter. Her movements were precise, economical, a woman who had learned to exist without drawing attention to herself. "The gentleman undertaker," she remarked, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into heavy crystal glasses. Daniel accepted the glass, surprised. "You were at Richard's service. I didn't see you." "I wasn't supposed to be seen." Isabella's gaze was direct, unapologetic. "I watched from the choir loft. I needed to be certain he was truly dead." The statement hung between them, stark in its honesty. Daniel took a measured sip, letting the bourbon warm his throat before responding. "Most brides don't hope their grooms are truly dead." "Most Marcello were not female Delacroix sons." Her voice remained even, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her glass. "Do you know what it's like, Mr. Blake, to be a valuable asset rather than a person? To know your worth is measured not by your mind or your heart, but by the alliances your body can secure."
Daniel thought of the corpses he'd tended, powerful men and ordinary women alike, all reduced to the same fragile vessels once life departed. "I don't pretend to understand that particular circumstance, Miss Marcello, but I've seen enough of what people do to each other to know that cruelty comes in many forms." Isabella nodded, seeming to find his answer acceptable. She set her barely touched bourbon aside and reached for the manila envelope on the table between them. "My father died 3 months ago," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Stomach cancer. A slow, painful death that even his money and connections couldn't prevent. I offered my condolences." A flicker of something, not quite grief, perhaps closer to vindication, crossed her features. "Before he died, he gave me this, said I would know when it was time to use it." She slid the envelope toward him. "That time is now." He hesitated before taking it. "Why me? I was just the man who prepared your fiancé's body. No, Mr. Blake. You were the Pinkerton who looked at Richard Delacroix's wounds and knew they were professional hits. The man who kept that observation to himself, even when the police were pushing their ridiculous theory about Chicago mobsters. The man who left detective work to bury the dead instead. You know when to speak and when to remain silent, a rare quality in this city. He opened the envelope and removed several aged photographs and a thin stack of handwritten letters. The first photograph showed young Richard Delacroix in an intimate embrace with another man, their expressions unguarded, tender. Daniel looked up sharply. Blackmail. Isabella laughed, a sound with little humor. That would have been simpler, wouldn't it? No, not blackmail. Richard Delacroix shared these with me himself. I don't understand. Richard Delacroix had no desire to marry me, Mr. Blake, and I had no desire to marry him. We were both pawns being moved across a board. She leant forward, her voice dropping. 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard came to me in secret. He showed me these photographs, told me about his lover, a musician, Jean Dubois. He begged me to help him escape the marriage without bringing shame to either family. Daniel studied the photographs more carefully. The second showed Richard and the same man, older now, at what appeared to be a private gathering. In the background, partially obscured but recognizable, was Joseph Delacroix, Richard's father. Joseph knew, Daniel said, the realization dawning. Yes, he knew. He had always known, and he was determined that his son would outgrow this phase by marrying into the Marcello family. Just as my father knew that I had fallen in love with my tutor when I was 17, a woman who taught me literature and independent thought. Both were dismissed as dangerous indulgences.
The pieces began falling into place for Daniel. The elaborate wedding, the forceful joining of two unwilling people, the fathers determined to bend their children to their will. But this doesn't explain the shooting, he said, continuing to examine the contents of the envelope. Isabella withdrew another photograph from her dress pocket, one that hadn't been in the envelope. It showed Angelo Marcello and Joseph Delacroix seated at a table with city officials, documents spread before them. This was taken 3 months before the wedding. My father and Joseph were finalizing a deal with the City Planning Commission. The Marcellos would provide the labor and materials. The Delacroix would secure the permits and political support. Together, they would rebuild the harbor district, transforming it from dock workers' shacks to luxury accommodations for the wealthy. Hundreds of families would be displaced, but millions would be made. Urban renewal, Daniel murmured, the term leaving a sour taste. He'd seen such projects destroy communities across the country. They called it progress, Isabella countered, her contempt evident. The marriage was to be the public face of their partnership, old money and new, united for the betterment of New Orleans. She paused, her gaze distant. But Richard had discovered something else, something that made him dangerous to his own father. She gestured to the letters. Daniel unfolded the top one, recognizing Richard's handwriting from documents he'd seen during the funeral arrangements. The letter detailed the discovery of contaminated soil in the harbor district, industrial waste that had seeped into the ground over decades. Building residential properties there would expose hundreds to toxic conditions. Richard had obtained soil samples, had them tested at Tulane University. He was going to expose them, Daniel said, understanding dawning. After the wedding? Isabella shook her head, taking a long slurp of her bourbon before answering. At the wedding, he had invited a reporter from the Times-Picayune, one not in the Delacroix's pocket. He planned to make a statement during his vows, to use the gathered witnesses as protection against immediate retaliation. "My God," Daniel whispered. But how did Joseph find out? Isabella's smile was thin. Richard's lover, Jean, was ambitious. When Joseph discovered their relationship years earlier, he didn't disown his son. He recruited Jean as an informant, paying him to report on Richard's activities while continuing their affair. The cruelty of this betrayal hung in the air between them. Daniel had seen many deceptions in his career, but few so personally devastating. Jean told Joseph about Richard's plan 3 days before the wedding. Joseph came to my father, told him everything. They agreed that Richard had become a liability that neither family could afford, and they decided he needed to die. Daniel concluded, the familiar weight of human depravity settling on his shoulders.
Not just die. Die publicly, violently, in a way that would generate sympathy for both families and distract from any accusations Richard might have made. Isabella's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. My father hired the gunman. Joseph approved the plan. They arranged for their own son, my intended husband, to be murdered on our wedding day. The rain seemed to intensify outside, matching the growing darkness of her revelation. Daniel refilled his glass, needing the burn of alcohol to process what he was hearing. You knew this would happen? He asked finally. Isabella's eyes flashed. If I had known, don't you think I would have warned him? Richard and I weren't in love, but we were allies against our father's ambitions. He trusted me with his secrets. I trusted him with mine. She stood abruptly, moving to the window to watch the storm. Her silhouette was sharp against the gray light, her posture revealing the iron will that had sustained her through a decade of silence. I realized what had happened the moment I heard the shots. I saw it in my father's eyes when he returned to the church, not shock or grief, but satisfaction. Cold, calculated satisfaction. Her voice grew quieter. That night, when he thought I was sedated, I overheard him on the telephone with Joseph, confirming that all evidence had been contained. Why didn't you go to the police? Daniel asked, though he knew the answer. Isabella turned from the window, her expression sardonic. The police? In 1933? In New Orleans? When my father owned half the force and Joseph Delacroix played poker with the commissioner? She shook her head. I wasn't that naive, Mr. Blake. I knew my options were limited to one: survival. So you disappeared behind the Marcello estate walls? I became a ghost, the tragic almost bride, too fragile for public appearances. In reality, I was a prisoner. My father feared what I might have known, what Richard might have told me. He kept me isolated, watched, controlled, supposedly for my own protection. Her bitter laugh echoed in the sparsely furnished room. I let him believe I was broken. It was easier that way, safer. I read, I observed, I planned, and I waited. For what? Isabella returned to a seat, her movements fluid, yet somehow weighted with purpose. For him to die, for the evidence in that envelope to come to me, for the chance to ensure that what they did to Richard, what they planned to do to hundreds of families in the Harbor District, would not be forgotten or forgiven. Daniel studied her face, seeing not vengeance, but a determined quest for justice long delayed.
And now, what do you want from me? The harbor development project was shelved after Richard's death, too much negative attention, but Joseph Delacroix has revived it. Construction begins next month with full city approval. The contamination remains, perhaps worse after sitting undisturbed for a decade. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I want you to help me stop it, Mr. Blake, to finish what Richard started.
I'm a funeral director now, Miss Marcello, not a detective. You're a man who knows how to investigate without drawing attention. A man with no obvious connection to either family. A man who, I suspect, still believes in justice even when it seems impossible. Her gaze held his. And you're the only person in New Orleans who's looked at me since that day and seen a woman, not a victim or a symbol. The air between them seemed charged with possibility and danger. Daniel thought of his quiet life among the dead, the peace he had cultivated after years of witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty. That peace had always been an illusion, he realized. The dead were quiet, but their secrets remained, waiting for someone brave enough to give them voice. "Tell me everything," he said finally. "Everything you know, everything you suspect. Leave nothing out." Isabella Marcello's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly, the first genuine emotional response he'd seen from her. It begins with the harbor soil reports, and it ends with Joseph Delacroix's current partnership with City Council President William Hayes. Outside, the storm began to subside, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. But within that sparse, anonymous house, the true tempest was only beginning to gather force. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The next 3 weeks transformed Daniel Blake in ways he hadn't experienced since his Pinkerton days. Dormant instincts reawakened as he moved through New Orleans with renewed purpose, his undertaker's somber demeanor providing perfect cover for a man gathering evidence of decades-old corruption. The August heat pressed down on the city like a fevered hand. Even in the early morning, humidity clung to skin and clothing, a constant reminder of New Orleans' defiance of human comfort. Daniel's collar was already damp as he climbed the worn marble steps of the Times-Picayune building, the newspaper's Art Deco facade standing proud against the cloudless blue sky. Inside, electric fans fought a losing battle against the heat, pushing warm air in circles while reporters hunched over typewriters, sleeves rolled to their elbows, ashtrays overflowing beside stacks of notes. The rhythmic clacking of keys mixed with the distant rumble of printing presses below. The heartbeat of a newspaper still robust despite the economic hardships that had shuttered so many others across the country. "Mr. Sullivan will see you now," announced the receptionist, a no-nonsense woman whose carefully applied makeup was already showing signs of surrender to the heat. She led Daniel through the newsroom, where curious glances followed the well-known funeral director's unexpected appearance among the living. Martin Sullivan's office was a testament to organized chaos. Stacks of newspapers, photographs pinned haphazardly to corkboards, and a perpetually full coffee pot on a hot plate in the corner. The air smelled of ink, paper, and the strong tobacco from Sullivan's ever-present cigarettes.
"Blake, the funeral man." Sullivan rose halfway from his chair, suspenders straining against his substantial midsection. His thinning hair looked as though he'd run his fingers through it 100 times since breakfast, and ink stains marked his rolled-up shirt sleeves. "What brings you to the land of the living? Usually we only see you when one of our own needs your professional services." Daniel settled into the chair across from Sullivan's cluttered desk, placing his hat on his knee. I'm researching a historical matter for a client's family. Thought you might be able to help. Historical, eh? How far back? He reached for his coffee cup, revealing yellowed fingertips from decades of handling newsprint and smoking unfiltered cigarettes. 1933, September 16th. Sullivan's jovial expression froze mid-sip, then recalibrated into something more guarded. He set his cup down with deliberate care. The Delacroix shooting. That's a peculiar interest for a funeral director. I prepared the body, Daniel said simply, watching Sullivan's reaction. The family has questions that have lingered. Anniversary's coming up, 10 years next month. Sullivan leaned back, his wooden chair protesting the shift in weight. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Daniel's face, seemingly weighing how much to reveal. There's not much to tell that wasn't in the papers. Young Richard Delacroix shot dead on his wedding day. Police blamed Chicago mobsters trying to muscle into New Orleans territory. Case closed faster than a French Quarter bar during Lent. And you believed that theory? Daniel kept his tone casual, conversational. I barked a laugh that contained new humor. It didn't matter what I believed. I was 23, eager to break a big story. My editor assigned it to Harold Winston, a man who played poker with both Joseph Delacroix and Police Commissioner Reynolds. He tapped his desk with stubby fingers. Winston is managing editor now. I still cover the crime beat. Draw your own conclusions. The story disappeared after 3 days. Daniel had reviewed the archives at Isabella's lakefront home. Buried on page 12, then gone completely. He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the privacy of his office. Look, Blake, I don't know what you're really after, but that story was killed from above. There were rumors. What kind of rumors? Daniel pressed gently. Sullivan studied Daniel's face, seeming to weigh his words carefully. He reached for a bottom drawer, producing a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. It's not even noon, he said, pouring generous measures into both. But this isn't a conversation I have sober. Daniel accepted the glass, understanding the ritual of trust it represented. Sullivan downed half his bourbon in one swallow, then continued in a quieter voice. Rumors that Richard Delacroix wasn't the dutiful son everyone thought he was, that he had unconventional relationships, that he might have discovered something damaging about his father's business dealings. He paused, but none of that was ever substantiated.
Daniel nodded, keeping his expression neutral as he took a small sip of the bourbon, cheap but effective. What about the harbor development project that was being discussed back then? The one that got shelved after the shooting? Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly. Now, that's an interesting connection to make. Not many people remember that project anymore. He pulled open another drawer, extracting a slim folder. It's coming back to life, you know. The Delacroix Development Company just broke ground last week. Joseph is calling it his legacy project, the Renaissance Harbor. He slid a press release across the desk. The glossy photograph showed Joseph Delacroix breaking ground with a silver shovel, flanked by the mayor and several city council members. A new era for New Orleans waterfront, proclaimed the headline. I've heard, Daniel said. Any opposition to the project? Not publicly. A few environmental concerns from Tulane scientists, but they've been assured that modern construction methods will address any issues. Sullivan's expression grew curious. As you take another swallow of bourbon, why the interest in ancient waterfront property deals, Blake? Doesn't seem like funeral business. Daniel offered a small smile. Just being thorough for my client. One last question. Do you remember a reporter who might have been invited to the Delacroix Marcello wedding, someone not in the Delacroix circle?
Sullivan's pause was almost imperceptible, but Daniel caught it. The slight widening of the eyes, a momentary stillness, a journalist's face that had learned to hide reactions, but not quite perfectly. "There was one," Sullivan finally said, finishing his bourbon. "James Cordell. Ambitious kid, newer than me. Had some northern education, always talking about investigative journalism and speaking truth to power. His tone was carefully neutral. He left New Orleans rather suddenly after the shooting. I heard he moved to Chicago, then New York. Never kept in touch." "But he was invited to the wedding?" "He claimed he had an exclusive perspective on the event, wouldn't tell anyone his source. His day after the shooting, his apartment was ransacked. Police called it a burglary, but nothing of value was taken, just his notes and camera." "And no one found that suspicious?" Sullivan's laugh was hollow. "In 1933 New Orleans? We all found it suspicious, Blake. We just valued our necks too much to say so." He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "There's something else you should know. Winston, my editor, who buried the story, he had a stroke last year. During his recovery, apparently he got religion, started talking about clearing his conscience before meeting his maker." Daniel's interest sharpened. "Did he mention the Delacroix case?" "Not specifically, but he handed me a key to a safety deposit box before he retired. Said I'd know when it was time to open it." Sullivan's eyes met Daniel's. "Maybe that time is now."
Daniel stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sullivan. You've been very helpful." Sullivan shook his hand, then held it a moment longer than necessary. "Whatever you're digging into, Blake, be careful. Some graves are shallow for a reason. Makes it easier to check if the body's still there." The First National Bank of New Orleans stood as a temple to financial stability, marble columns and brass fixtures designed to assure customers that their money and secrets were equally secure within its walls. The safety deposit room manager, a thin man with spectacles and immaculate fingernails, examined the key Sullivan had provided and Daniel's identification with equal scrutiny. "Mr. Winston's authorization is quite specific, Mr. Blake. You may examine the contents, but nothing may be removed without his written consent." "I understand," Daniel assured him. Left alone in a small viewing room, Daniel opened the narrow metal box with reverent care. Inside lay a brown paper package tied with string and sealed with wax, along with an envelope addressed simply, "For the Seeker of Truth." The letter inside was brief. "To whoever Winston deems worthy. What follows is my insurance policy. Photographs and notes I was ordered to destroy regarding the Delacroix case. I kept them against explicit instructions because a journalist should document, not destroy, even when pressured by powers beyond his control. I am a coward who chose career over truth. Perhaps you will make a better choice. James Cordell." Daniel unwrapped the package with careful fingers. Inside were several photographs, their edges yellowed with age. The first showed Richard Delacroix in animated conversation with a young woman Daniel recognized immediately as Isabella. Not the composed, distant bride of newspaper photos, but an engaged, passionate woman gesturing emphatically as she spoke. The second showed Richard meeting with what appeared to be a professor at Tulane, exchanging an envelope. The third, most damning image captured Isabella Marcello and Joseph Delacroix in the back room of a restaurant, heads bent close over documents, with a third man Daniel didn't recognize. A small notebook completed the package, its pages filled with Cordell's neat shorthand. Daniel flipped through it, finding dates, times, and cryptic notations. One page was devoted to what appeared to be a chemical analysis, the same compounds listed in the Tulane soil report. As Daniel carefully returned the items to their package, he understood why Cordell had fled, why Winston had buried the story, why Isabella had spent a decade waiting for the right moment. This wasn't just evidence of environmental crimes. It was proof of a conspiracy that reached into every powerful institution in New Orleans. The library at Tulane University offered blessed relief from the heat. Daniel moved through the cool marble halls to the office of Dr. Lawrence Whitfield, professor of environmental science.
The professor's secretary, a sharp-eyed woman who guarded his calendar like a dragon with treasure, had reluctantly granted Daniel 15 minutes of the busy academic's time. "Mr. Blake?" Dr. Whitfield rose from behind his desk, a tall man with a stooped posture that suggested years bent over microscopes and field samples. "How may I help a funeral director? I hope you're not here about one of my colleagues." Daniel shook the professor's offered hand. "Nothing so morbid, Dr. Whitfield. I'm researching historical environmental conditions in the Harbor District for a client interested in property there." The lie came easily, a necessary tool in this investigation. Whitfield gestured for Daniel to sit, interest flickering across his scholarly features. The Harbor District, fascinating area from an environmental perspective, significant industrial activity since the 1880s with virtually no regulation until recently. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "What specifically interests your client?" "Soil contamination reports, particularly any testing done around 1933. Whitfield's posture stiffened slightly, his thin fingers tapping a pencil against his desk blotter. "That's a very specific request, Mr. Blake." "My client is thorough," Daniel replied simply. A clock ticked loudly on the wall as Whitfield seemed to contemplate his response. The office smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, though no pipe was visible. Through the window, students crossed the campus lawn, laughing and chatting in the carefree manner of those untouched by the darker workings of the city surrounding them. Finally, Whitfield rose and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of his book-lined office. The metal drawer opened with a reluctant screech that suggested it wasn't accessed frequently. "In 1933, I was a graduate student here at Tulane. My mentor, Dr. Harold Griffin, was approached by a young man with soil samples from the Harbor District. He withdrew a thin folder. The results were concerning." Daniel leaned forward. "May I ask who brought the samples?" "I believe it was Richard Delacroix. Yes, from the shipping family." Whitfield placed the folder on his desk, but kept his hand atop it. "I remember because it was unusual, a young man from such a privileged background showing interest in environmental science. This was long before ecology became fashionable, you understand." "What did the samples show?" "The samples showed dangerous levels of arsenic, lead, and several petroleum derivatives, industrial waste that had been improperly disposed of for decades, a toxic cocktail that had leached into the groundwater." "And what happened with this information?" Whitfield's expression clouded. "Dr. Griffin prepared a report. Young Delacroix was quite agitated when he collected it. Mentioned something about evidence and responsibility. A week later, he was dead. That tragic shooting at his wedding." He slid the folder toward Daniel. "After that, no one ever inquired about the harbor soil again. Until now." Daniel opened the folder to find yellowed pages of chemical analyses, graphs, and a map marked with sample collection points. "This is the original report?" "A copy. Dr. Griffin kept meticulous records."
Whitfield's voice lowered. The contamination would make the area wholly unsuitable for residential development without extensive remediation, millions of dollars worth. Knowledge that might be valuable to someone considering property there, or to someone planning to build there without proper remediation, Daniel added. Whitfield's eyes met his. Indeed. I've seen the announcements about the Renaissance Harbor project. Curiously, no one has consulted our department, despite the site's history. Would you testify to these findings, if necessary, Dr. Whitfield? The professor removed his glasses, polishing them deliberately with a handkerchief. The action gave him time to consider the weight of Daniel's question. When he replaced his glasses, his expression had hardened with resolve. Mr. Blake, I have tenure and a reputation built on scientific integrity. If these findings became relevant in an official capacity, I would certainly stand by their accuracy. He paused. Dr. Griffin passed away 5 years ago. In many ways, I am the custodian of his scientific legacy. I would not see it compromised by political or financial pressures. Daniel carefully placed the report back in its folder. May I borrow this? I'll ensure its safe return. For academic purposes, I can loan it for 1 week. Though I must say this is unusual interest from a funeral director. In my profession, Dr. Whitfield, I've learned that the past never truly dies. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to be exhumed. The Delacroix mansion in the Garden District stood as a monument to old New Orleans money. Greek Revival columns, intricate ironwork, and a sweeping oak-lined drive that kept the outside world at a respectful distance. Built in 1857, it had weathered the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the shifting fortunes of a city defined by both natural and man-made disasters. Daniel observed it from his parked Packard across the street, watching as the evening lights came on one by one behind leaded glass windows. Gas lamps still illuminated the estate's gardens, casting golden pools across manicured lawns where magnolias stood like silent sentinels. Isabella sat beside him, nearly unrecognizable in a dark wig and modest dress that suggested a secretary rather than an heiress. Her gloved hands were perfectly still in her lap, but Daniel sensed the tension radiating from her. "You don't have to do this part," he said quietly. "I can handle the meeting alone."
I've waited 10 years to look Joseph Delacroix in the eye, knowing what he did to his own son. Her voice was soft but resolute. I won't miss this opportunity. Daniel nodded, understanding. The past 3 weeks had revealed Isabella Marcello to be far more than the tragic bride of newspaper headlines. She was methodical, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet determination that had sustained her through a decade of calculated patience. Together, they had pieced together the evidence. Richard's soil reports from Tulane confirming dangerous contamination. Financial records showing the massive profit potential of the harbor development. Photographs and letters documenting the conspiracy between Angelo Marcello and Joseph Delacroix. And most damning, the testimony of Jean Dubois, Richard's former lover, now living in obscurity in Baton Rouge. Daniel had tracked Dubois down through old Pinkerton contacts. The man, broken by guilt and years of alcohol abuse, had confessed his role in betraying Richard, providing a signed affidavit that implicated Joseph Delacroix in planning his own son's murder.
"He's alone tonight," Isabella noted, observing the mansion. "His wife is in Charleston, visiting her sister. The servants have Thursdays off, except for his driver and cook. He'll see us. He's too curious not to." Daniel checked his watch. It's time. They approached the mansion, gravel crunching beneath their shoes in the humid evening air. Cicadas pulsed their summer symphony from the surrounding trees. The night-blooming jasmine released its sweet perfume into the darkness, a scent that had become synonymous with New Orleans evenings. Daniel rang the bell, hearing its deep chime echo inside the cavernous house. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a musical harbinger of the confrontation to come. The door opened to reveal Joseph Delacroix himself, older now at 68, his once imposing frame slightly stooped, but his eyes still sharp beneath silver brows. He wore a smoking jacket and held a cut-crystal tumbler of what was likely expensive bourbon. "Yes?" His gaze moved from Daniel to Isabella, showing no recognition of the woman his son had nearly married. "Mr. Delacroix," Daniel began, "my name is Daniel Blake. I believe you recall my services from your son's funeral. This is my associate, Miss Reynolds. We have a matter of some urgency to discuss regarding the Renaissance Harbor project." Joseph's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Wariness, perhaps. "It's rather late for business discussions, Mr. Blake, and I'm puzzled why a funeral director would have any interest in my development project. It concerns certain historical findings that may impact the viability of the development, findings that your son Richard was aware of." The name hung in the air between them. Joseph's knuckles whitened around his glass, but his voice remained steady. "Very well. Come in." Chapter 5. The White Dress.
Dawn broke over Lake Pontchartrain in delicate watercolor strokes of pink and gold. Isabella stood on the small dock behind her lakefront home, watching as mist rose from the water's surface. She wore a simple white dress, not a wedding gown, but a deliberate echo of what might have been, what never was. The past 48 hours had unfolded with dizzying speed. Joseph Delacroix's late-night call to Police Commissioner Reynolds had set wheels in motion that even the aging patriarch couldn't control. The commissioner, now facing re-election and wary of scandal, had recognized the political suicide of protecting a decade-old conspiracy involving murdered sons and environmental crimes. Instead, Reynolds had contacted the district attorney, who in turn reached out to federal authorities. By morning, the Renaissance Harbor project was officially canceled. The Times-Picayune was running front-page exposés, and Joseph Delacroix had suffered a massive stroke upon learning that his own insurance against scandal had crumbled beneath him. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella. The man who had arranged his son's murder to protect his reputation was now confined to a hospital bed, unable to speak in his own defense, as that reputation disintegrated around him. She heard footsteps on the wooden planks of the dock and turned to see Daniel approaching, his silver hair catching the early light. He looked as exhausted as she felt, having spent hours with authorities, providing evidence and statements. "It's done," he said, echoing his words from 2 nights before, but with finality this time. Joseph signed the additional papers from his hospital bed. The land transfers to the city next week for the waterfront park. They're going to name it after Richard. Isabella nodded, a complicated emotion moving through her. Not quite the memorial he would have chosen for himself, but perhaps fitting nonetheless. Daniel stood beside her,
both of them watching a heron glide low over the water's surface. "The DA wants your formal statement this afternoon. After that, you're free to, well, to do whatever you want, I suppose." "Freedom." She tested the word as though it were in a foreign language. "I'm not sure I know what that means anymore." "It means you don't have to be the bride who disappeared. You can be whoever you choose," Daniel replied quietly. Isabella studied his profile, the lines etched by years of understanding both the dead and the living, the quiet dignity that had drawn her to trust him with her decade-long secret. "I've been thinking about that," she said, "about who I might become." "And?" "I'm considering opening a bookshop, something small, in the quarter, perhaps, a place where ideas can flourish. My literature tutor, the woman I told you about, she always said books were windows when doors were locked." Daniel returned her smile. "I think you'd be excellent at that."
They lapsed into comfortable silence, the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock pilings creating a soothing rhythm. In the distance, a jazz tune drifted from a passing boat, the mournful sound of a saxophone carrying over the water. "There's something I need to show you," Isabella said finally. "Something I've never shown anyone." She led Daniel back to the house and up the stairs to a room she had kept locked until now. The key turned with a heavy click, and she pushed the door open to reveal what appeared to be a shrine to an alternate life, one that had been violently interrupted 10 years before. In the center of the otherwise empty room stood a display form draped with her wedding dress, the elaborate creation of Venetian lace and handcrafted pearls that had remained untouched by the blood that day. Preserved perfectly, it seemed to glow with an almost unearthly light in the morning sun streaming through the windows. Daniel stopped in the doorway, understanding the sacred nature of this space. "You kept it all this time." Not out of sentimentality, but out of purpose. "Every morning for 10 years I would come in here and look at it, remember what it represented. Not love or romance, but the moment when I understood that my life was not my own, that men like my father and Joseph Delacroix believed they could trade human lives like playing cards." Her voice hardened. "It was my reminder to never forget, never forgive." Daniel approached the dress slowly. Up close, the craftsmanship was even more apparent. Thousands of tiny pearls sewn by hand, lace created by artisans whose families had practiced the craft for generations. "And now?" he asked. Isabella moved to stand beside the dress, her fingers lightly touching the delicate fabric. "Now it served its purpose. Like the girl who was meant to wear it, it belongs to another time." From her pocket, she withdrew a book of matches from the Roosevelt Hotel. With deliberate movements, she struck one and held the small flame near the hem of the dress. Daniel didn't move to stop her. This was her moment of catharsis, her ritual of release. But after a long moment, Isabella blew out the match, letting it fall unburned to the floor. "No," she said softly, "that would be too easy, too dramatic." A smile ghosted across her face. "I think, instead, I'll donate it. There's a theater company that might make good use of it. A beautiful costume for Ophelia or Desdemona or some other tragic bride." She turned to face Daniel fully. "The dress was never stained, never damaged. It deserves a second chance to be something other than a memorial to violence." Daniel nodded,
understanding the symbolism. As do you. Yes, she agreed, as do I. They left the room together, Isabella locking the door behind them one last time. Downstairs, she poured coffee into 2 china cups that had once belonged to her grandmother, another woman who had survived the machinations of powerful men.
"What happens next for you, Daniel?" she asked as they settled in the sunlit kitchen. "Back to the funeral home? Back to the quiet life?" He considered the question, turning the cup between his hands. "I'm not sure the quiet holds the same appeal it once did. These past weeks have reminded me that I'm still good at asking questions, at finding truths." "The Pinkerton reawakened," Isabella observed. "Perhaps, but not for just any client. Only for the right causes." His eyes met hers. "I was thinking of setting up a small investigative office. Nothing flashy, just a place where people who have nowhere else to turn might find someone willing to listen." "A noble endeavor." She hesitated, then added, "It might need financial backing." "Isabella," she continued, undeterred, "I have my inheritance now, Angelo Marcello's blood money. I can think of no better use for it than to redirect it toward justice." The proposition hung between them, not just a business arrangement, but something more personal, more meaningful, a partnership born from shared purpose. "We could call it the untouched truth," she suggested, a rare lightness entering her voice, a private nod to where it began. Daniel smiled, the weight of the past weeks lifting slightly from his shoulders. "I like that." Through the kitchen window, they could see the lake stretching toward the horizon, its surface now glittering with morning sun. New Orleans would soon be stirring to life. Sidewalks heating under the August sun, shopkeepers raising awnings, tourists emerging in search of coffee and beignets. The city would buzz with the fresh scandal of Joseph Delacroix's downfall. Reporters would race to uncover the full story of a decade-old murder and cover-up. Politicians would scramble to distance themselves from the tainted harbor project. The truth, or at least portions of it, would finally emerge into the light. But here in this kitchen, in this moment of quiet between night and day, between past and future, Isabella Marcello and Daniel Blake simply drank their coffee and allowed themselves to imagine what might come next. Later that afternoon, Isabella would give her statement to the district attorney. She would speak Richard's name aloud for the first time in 10 years, giving voice to the truth he had died trying to reveal. She would wear her simple white dress, not as a symbol of what she had lost, but as a declaration of her reclaimed identity. And Daniel would be waiting when she emerged from the imposing courthouse. Not as her investigator, not as her ally in revenge, but something not yet defined. A companion for whatever path she chose next. The wedding that never happened had cast a decade-long shadow over their lives. But as Isabella now understood, some stories that begin with blood can still end with hope. Some brides who lose their grooms can still find their way to a life worth living. And some dresses that remain untouched by tragedy can become symbols not of what was lost, but of what survived. As our story comes to a close, I hope you felt transported to the sultry streets of 1930s New Orleans, a world of hidden motives, buried truths, and unexpected courage. If this journey through time has resonated with you, if Isabella's quest for justice after a decade of silence has moved something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Every story I share is a doorway to lives both imagined and remembered, to worlds where the past speaks to us still. Join our community of listeners who understand that in the end, we are all defined not by the tragedies that befall us, but by how we rise to meet them. Until our next journey together, remember that even the most carefully preserved secrets eventually find their way into the light.